how did that happen? Did you bribe somebody? Like, did your parents know somebody, or what happened?
You can't get in if you don't apply. Historians are storytellers. Be an outlier, be a misfit, be weird, be interesting. And I got in because there was something about it that someone thought was interesting enough to give me a shot.
All right, Tim, how was your flight to London?
Great. Best flight I've ever had, actually. It was wonderful. So thank you for getting me over here across the pond.
No, amazing. All right, well, listen, just for those who, who've never met you, obviously you've got this, like, on paper, well, and in person, but, on paper have a lot of accomplishments. You're a professor at Harvard, have worked there for the last 25 years. But can we just, before we get into that, can you just tell us about, what did you do after high school? Like, because you were a student at Harvard, right? So how did that happen? Did you bribe somebody? Like, did your parents know somebody, or what happened?
Oh, God, no. We didn't have any money to bribe anyone with, and my parents definitely did not know anyone there. So I grew up in a working class family. My grandparents were immigrant stock from various parts of the world, and grew up in upstate New York, and went to a big public high school, which in the United States is, it was a good school, but it wasn't a great school. It certainly wasn't a feeder school to any prestigious university or college. So that wasn't part of my upbringing at all. I mean, I always knew I was going to go to college. My grandmother was a teacher and very, very keenly devoted to education. And so she understood the power of a college education because she was the first in her family to get one. And then it set her into a very different kind of life. My other grandparents were all factory workers and other kinds of working class jobs. And so they, most of them had not, one had finished high school, two had dropped out of high school. So education was important to them too, because they didn't have it. My grandmother had it and understood the power of it. And then my parents are both teachers, so the kids they raised were educators. So I always knew that education was important and college was important. And I always had my sights set high. But there was no world where I ever thought that going to a place like Harvard was possible, either that we could afford it or that I could get into it. And so when I was a senior in high school, I was a very gifted student, gifted and talented, we called them in the United States. And then I also was an athlete, and I was a pretty accomplished athlete in high school. And so I was getting recruited by some of the schools. And so I ended up applying to a bunch of places. I wasn't going to apply to Harvard, actually. And my father said, well, you can't. I said, I'll never get in. And he said, well, you can't get in if you don't apply. And that has been like a mantra in my head. I have said that to thousands of people, high schoolers who are applying to colleges, college students to graduate school to other kinds of things. That's the best piece of advice I ever got, right? And it was actually just a noticing, right? If you don't apply, you can't get in, which is just true. But it's also profound because it gets through the self-doubt and the lack of confidence, and which I definitely had both in abundance.
Which is normal, right? Like for a high school kid, yeah.
I would worry about anybody who's like, yeah, I'm going to Harvard. I'm like, whoa, okay. Aren't you confident? But I was definitely not that way. But I got in, and I was the second kid from my big public high school in upstate New York to get into Harvard. And actually, interestingly, there's a good story here, partly that I wrote my essay on for admissions. My father was a high school basketball coach, still coaches high school basketball, and he's been coaching for 50 some odd years. He was my coach. And my father started coaching in the late 60s and early 70s, and he had a student on, I think, his first varsity basketball team named Peter DeGarian, who was a very gifted student, also a very good basketball player, who got into Harvard from my high school in 1973, 72, really early on, shortly after I was born. And Peter DeGarian, who was on my dad's team, and his best friend, Mark Burlingame, who were the co-captains of the team, gave me my first Dr. Seuss book called McElligot's Pool, which is about a little kid fishing in a little water hole, and this old man comes by and says, why are you fishing in McElligot's Pool? You'll never catch a fish in McElligot's Pool. And so the kid's like, but this is just a little pool, but it's actually a whole world and a whole ocean. I won't bore you with the story. It's an amazing book. It's an amazing thing. I read it, and I read it, and read it, and read it. And then when I got time to go to college, I applied to Harvard, and I wrote one of my essays about that book, my literature essay, which most most kids were writing about War and Peace or Steinbeck or something else. I wrote about a Dr. Seuss book, but because it was connected to this one guy who had gone to Harvard from my hometown, who my dad also coached. So there was a connection that way. Turns out that essay and the essays I wrote worked somehow, and I got in, and I went. And at my graduation party from high school, my cousin asked my father, Tommy, my dad's name is Tom, how are you and Michelle, my mom's name is Michelle, how are you and Michelle, how can you and Michelle afford to send Timmy to Harvard? And I overheard the conversation, and my father responded without missing a beat. My mother was nodding. How can we afford not to? And to this day, I have no idea how they afforded Harvard. They paid for it. I don't have a lot of debt from it. I have a lot of debt from graduate school, but not from college. They figured out a way, because they always figured out a way. I was the only child, only grandchild. The American dream was just like heaped onto me, and I had to make good on that. And so I went. I got in somehow. I went, and it changed my life.
All right, Tim. So you get to Harvard. You do 4 years of college there, and then you move back to. Well, not to New York City because you were in upstate New York, not in New York City, but you moved to New York City to join Columbia, right, for your grad school. And why not just stay at Harvard and do this? Because we get a lot of students who say, well, I've done my undergrad at Oxford or LSE or NYU, Sunny, why don't I just stay here for grad school? And I always tell them, go somewhere different because, new experience, etc. But why did you move to a different place?
I'm so glad you said that, because I can only answer that in retrospect now that I've gone through a PhD program and gotten 2 masters and PhD and also did undergrad at 2 different places. The reason I would tell people now is go somewhere if you liked college, go somewhere different from graduate school, because graduate school is miserable and you want to preserve the happy nostalgia of your college years. So I was miserable in graduate school. PhD programs are not fun, and it's a long time of not having fun. And so now I look back and I'm like, well, I went to Columbia because I needed somewhere to hate because I loved Harvard. And now I'm back at Harvard teaching, so that's interesting. But I think the real reason I did it was because the program was great. The history, I was an American history PhD student, and at the time Columbia was the top, or one of the top programs in the field. And the leading scholar of what I wanted to study, Eric Foner, was a professor at Columbia. And my undergraduate mentor at Harvard, David Herbert Donald, who's a scholar of Civil War Reconstruction and biographer of Abraham Lincoln. I was his last undergraduate, so I worked as a research assistant on his Lincoln biography, which came out in 1995. And he had taught Eric Foner when Eric Foner was a graduate student at Columbia. And so he knew Foner, not that it was nepotism, but this was an example of like I did know somebody, or someone I knew somebody. And so he said, my advisor, Professor Donald, said, you need to go to Columbia and study with Eric Foner. Easier said than done. I still had to apply and get in, but that's why I was so keenly interested in Columbia. I applied to other schools, other top schools in American history, and I got into about half of them. I got rejected from half of them. And
just to pick up on that, that's another, very important thing, especially for all people, but especially for young people, right? Like you just got to spread your bets
totally
and see, you win some, you lose some, right?
Yeah. Well, you should never set your sights on one place and only apply to that place. That's really risking disappointment. And absolutely cast your net widely. I mean, for graduate school, you can't cast your net so widely because you got to figure out what discipline, your set of disciplines you want a degree in, and what the best places are, because that really matters for job market stuff later on. But cast your net widely in that way, and don't put all of your eggs in one basket. Even if you're applying early decision, right, have some other places that if you don't get in early decision, you can apply to that you're happy about. Because sometimes, especially when you're young, like I thought I wanted to go to Dartmouth. I was like, I want to go to Dartmouth. Dartmouth was recruiting me. I was like, I want to go there. And I was like, why would I want to go to like a remote New Hampshire as opposed to like Boston and Cambridge? Like that does not make any sense now when I look back. And I probably would have been miserable at Dartmouth. Dartmouth is a great place for some people, but I had my sights set on that. I got deferred and rejected from Dartmouth. Actually, it's the one school when I applied to college that I got rejected from. Not that I'm.
I sense a bit of beef.
Not that I'm holding on to that at 54. But anyway, I did not go to Dartmouth. But Dartmouth wouldn't have been the place for me, and I thought it would be. So I think even when you're younger, even when you're applying to grad school, but specifically when you're in high school applying to college, you have no idea what college is like because you've never been there, and college is a very different experience than studying in high school, even if you're at a boarding school or away from home. And, what matters to you and what is important to you will change from 18 to 22 or whenever you're in college. And the place that you thought was the right fit might not be. So, always do your homework and cast your net widely.
All right, Tim, and just moving on, I'm making an observation here, if I may. You meet history professors, they're normally quite bookish, they're not very loud. I mean, you're the opposite of not very loud.
Yeah, I have a robust personality.
Yeah, you got a lot of presence. So how do you go from doing American history PhD to then teaching communication and leadership at Harvard University at the business school where, which is, you got like the sharks and, kids go there to, generate value, right?
That's, of course, and make value.
Make value. You go to the Kennedy School where, so how did you go from a bookish history PhD to teaching this stuff?
Yeah, well, I was always bookish by practice, but not bookish by temperament, if that makes sense. I love books. I still buy books. I don't read ebooks. I love books. I'm surrounded by books. I just purged some of my books, and it was like traumatic to get rid of those books because I've been accumulating a library for 40 years, and I just don't have room for them. But I love books. I love reading. I'm a total nerd. I love history. I love the History Channel. All that stuff. But historians are storytellers. And all of my great history professors were great lecturers. They were great storytellers. David Herbert Donald had this southern drawl, and he spoke a little slowly, and he'd talk about being on the porch in Mississippi and the way the dog would come in at just the right time at night. And then, so he would tell stories, and he would get up there and he would tell these stories that were true. They were historical stories. But he would tell them in such a way that would transport you back to the 19th century. And he would talk about battles in the Civil War, and you were like at Gettysburg. And that was dazzling to listen to and to watch. And sometimes I would just witness it. I wouldn't even take notes because it was so good. And he did that twice a week, all semester. And I was like, I want to be that when I grow up. He gave his last lecture in his famous Civil War and Reconstruction class at Harvard. And I still remember the whole passage about goat milk. Like, I don't know what he was talking about goat milk, but he was talking about goat milk in the most compelling way. And he talked about the twilight of Reconstruction and how it was ending after the Civil War and the promise of abolition. And he told this amazing story about the downfall of America's very brief commitment to multiracial democracy. And when I tell you there wasn't a dry eye in that room, and everyone rose to their feet when he was done. That was his last lecture of his career, not just the semester. So there was a certain energy to the room. But he dazzled us every day. Foner, same thing, very different kind of guy. He was from New York. He had a New York accent. He tells these really funny stories. He's got he's a bit of a shit giver, right? His personality was part of that. Every single, Manning Marable was my professor in graduate school, mentor, head of African American studies. So he taught the big course on Black history and politics. And that was just dazzling. You were introduced to abolitionists and civil rights activists and all these things. So historians are storytellers. The best historians can tell stories on the page through their writing and their words, and they can tell stories in public at the podium. So for me, it's not a wide chasm between the sort of bookishness that goes into becoming a historian in the archives and consumed with other ages that are past, and the ability to translate that and to communicate that in public. The other thing too is that I was really drawn in my own writing first to Abraham Lincoln and then to Frederick Douglass, who were both, were both orators of a certain caliber. Frederick Douglass was known to be this brilliant, kind of charismatic orator who spoke in public all the time. Lincoln was also known to be, if you think about speech per president, Lincoln's known for more speeches as president than almost any other president, including maybe FDR, who got elected to 4 terms. Lincoln was assassinated right at the beginning of his. So I was drawn not only to great storytellers who were historians, who could write and speak and lecture, but I was also drawn to people in history, activists, orators, these kinds of folks who also were great speakers. So when the opportunity came to teach a leadership and communications course, which is another story, I felt totally unprepared for it because I'd never studied formally leadership or communications. I studied history and literature and African American studies. I was, it turns out, prepared to teach leadership and communication because I'd been focused on presidents and activists and orators and storytellers and had become one in my own way. So in a weird way, even though on paper I would not have been the best person to hire for a leadership and communications background, being a historian and being a storyteller and studying people who were, compelling activists and leaders really did set me up to teach it, the way I've been teaching it.
Great. And Tim, we're recording this from London.
Yeah.
You just flew to teach one of the modules in our core curriculum on communication in person. It was partially online, this final part in person. Just tell us a bit more. Well, I know, but the guys viewing it don't know.
Yeah.
What's your link with A&J? How does a professor at Harvard become involved with college counseling / online high school?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is that you came to Harvard and I got to know you there, and we've been in touch ever since. And then when you both founded and expanded this work through A&J School, we've been in touch about that, and obviously I've more recently joined as an advisory board member, and so it was really, I'm compelled by you. I think you're a really wonderful visionary person, someone who's been, in my experience, very easy to work with and very generous in that way.
Thanks for saying this. Whoever's editing this video, can we make sure that this part
make sure it's on? Yes, we'll keep that. We can edit all the other stuff that I've said. But I mean that's the short answer. Is we met each other a while ago. We've maintained our relationship, and here I am in London teaching these kids that you've put together in this program. And so I admire your work immensely, and I don't sign on to everything that I get asked to do because I'm increasingly busy and get more requests. But this seemed really important, and it's something that I value relationships and the doing right by them. But also I do a lot of work with. I now teach mostly graduate students, but I taught in the college for many, many years.
For those who don't know, college means at undergraduate level.
Yes. So college is the undergraduate level, usually roughly between the ages of 18 to 22. And the graduate students are beyond that. So they're post-undergraduate bachelor's degree. Right.
Yep.
So I teach master's students and doctoral students at the Kennedy School of Government and at the Graduate School of Education. And I've also taught at the business school at Harvard. And so, but I also do a lot of work because I spend a lot of time in education spaces. I do a lot of work with high schools, and a lot of where I used to be an interviewer for Harvard. I've done some college counseling stuff. I know a lot of people who are in that world, like you and others. And so I'm really interested in how we can support students where they are and to give them the broadest and deepest possible education, and then help them move from one place to another. When I think about what happened in my life, the transformational change that happened in my life when I went from Harvard when I went from Guilderland High School in upstate New York to Harvard, and then from Harvard to Columbia, right? Big changes and transformational ones that have impacted who I am today. And so why not try to pay that forward or pay that back in some way by working with people throughout that whole kind of trajectory and pipeline. And weirdly, I think I'm equipped to do that because I have obviously been all those stages of my life, but I also work with kids currently from high school all the way through their graduate degrees. So I like working with people as they go on their journeys. It's something that's important to me.
That's great. And and the feedback I've been receiving from from the students on the course, both the online and the in-person component, has been amazing. So you're not fraud. You do
great. Well, that's good.
You know what you're talking about.
I've enjoyed working with them. It's amazing. They're a very diverse group of folks, both in terms of age range and in terms of where they're from in the world and what they're doing, what they're studying. I've learned a lot about them, and we've just been doing this for a couple of weeks, but I feel like I've learned a lot. I'd love to continue the relationships with them because they seem like really compelling students. And now being here in London offers me an opportunity, a bit of a hybrid opportunity, right? I've been with them online for 2 weeks and then flew over here, which is my first time in London in a while, and then I'm meeting with a smaller group of them, but those who are here in London in person, we've been able to spend some time together here, and that's great too. I always love that.
No, cool. Tim, just wrapping this up, because I know that you've got limited time. If a young person who's thinking about applying to college, for their bachelor's bachelor studies or thinking of applying for grad school, so their master's or PhD, what would you say your top 3 pieces of advice, non-generic advice, not the kind of advice, work hard, be on top, anybody can say that, but 3 non-generic pieces of advice from somebody who got into Harvard, got into Columbia, and then, works at Harvard. What would you say?
Yeah. First thing I would say is that know that you're going to change. And this is related to casting the net widely, right? Is that you what you think you're going to do now, what you want to study, the place you want to be, the person that you are, all those things can change over a time in a course of study. Actually, if education is doing its job, you will change because you should change. You don't come to a graduate program or a college and go through that work and pay for that work in many cases to stay the same. So be open to change and know that that will probably happen, and it should. So that's the first thing I would say, which then leads to the making sure that you're looking at lots of different options and have guides to help you do that. That's the first thing. The second thing is don't be afraid to be yourself. That one of the things that I think is a problem is that there are a lot of people, not you, not A&J, but there are a lot of people who do college counseling and help people with their applications and those kinds of things. And I know some of them, and some of those businesses are very lucrative, and some people do it really well. But it's a mixed bag. And one of the things that I find problematic about some college counseling offerings is that they want to shoehorn kids into a sort of caricature or a sort of a model or a framework or a narrative that doesn't fit them. And they do it because they think that that's what's going to help get them in to Oxford or to Yale or to wherever.
Like a classic one would be doing an essay with a story of some just fake struggle that they've,
Right. Yeah. No, like a struggle story that's not real. Like someday they're going to find that out. And there are lots of examples of when people have been exposed and it's ultimately later on in life ruined their career, sometimes gotten them kicked out of school. Right. That happens. But, like getting back to my own story, not to use myself as an example, but I am going to use myself as an example, is that I was told that I should write my literature essay for Harvard on Steinbeck or Hemingway or some classic canonical author. I wrote it on Dr. Seuss, also a classic and canonical author, but it's a children's book. But I had a story to tell about that children's book, why I love the message of it, which is a message of optimism in the face of something that doesn't seem possible. And it's also about intergenerational stuff. And it's connected to a guy my father coached. Right? And I wrote about that because that was important to me. And because I still love Dr. Seuss. The books I did not give away recently when I purged books, my whole Dr. Seuss collection. So don't be afraid to be yourself. Be an outlier, be a misfit, be weird, be interesting, right? People are not drawn to the same thing over and over and over again. It's one of the reasons why people love art, right? Art delights, it surprises, right? It does something that you yourself imagine. And so don't be afraid to be yourself, especially if you're odd in some way, which is really counterintuitive for a lot of young people, because so much of being young, right, and being in school is you want to fit in. You don't want to be an outlier. You don't want to be a misfit. You don't want to be the nerd. You don't want to be the person who's like stands out. But if you are that person, lean into that and be that person. And then the third thing I would say is learn how to tell your story on your terms. And this is related to that. But I think sometimes people get sort of packaged, like ChatGPT should not write your essays, or your emails, or your letters to your college counselor or to your parents when you're at college, when you write home, right? You need to write your story. You're not going to write someone else's story. It's not a work of fiction, right? You're not going to let someone else do it. That's cheating or laziness or both. And so tell your own story. Figure out who you are at this point in your life, how you got here, why you want to do the things that you're saying you want to do, that you're spending time applying to do. And I will say this, I spend a lot of time every year on admissions committees. So at Harvard, the faculty have a role to play in admitting the students. And it is very easy to spot now those people who have been packaged and those people who have allowed someone else to do the work for them, and those people who have no idea who they are. And those are the people who tend to get sifted out sooner and earlier in the process. And so admissions committees, especially at elite schools, they do very, very careful screening, right? Harvard gets the undergraduates at Harvard. There are like 60,000 people apply every year, and they admit like 1.8% of them. And all of those people are valedictorians or perfect scores on their AP. Harvard could fill its freshman class, its first year class every year. There are other schools too that are in this case, with all valedictorians, all perfect SAT scores, all perfect AP scores, all people from private school, all valedictorians. Harvard could pick one thing that marks excellence and admit 1,600 people who all have that in common. I didn't have any of those things in common. None of that was true of me, what I just said. And I got in because there was something about it that someone thought was interesting enough to give me a shot, and that changed my life. So, don't standardize yourself. Right.
No, that's right. And by the way, guys, those of you who, as you know, and if you haven't read it, I'm gonna give you a signed copy of my book, University Admissions Explained.
Yes. You know more. I don't know why I'm telling you. You know more about this than I do. But I am on the committees on the.
Look, I'm the guy who writes the book, how to do it, and gets it from the outside. But you're one of the decision makers from the inside. But there is a lot of activities, right? And in Sunny's admissions formula, which is a 7-step formula, there is a CV component, which can be academic and non-academic, and there are like 13 different things, 13 different types of activity that you can do. And a lot of kids are like, well, Sunny, okay, we're just going to do all 13. And I'm like, no, this is dumb. It's impossible to be interested and engaged in all 13 activities. Pick 1 or 2, 3 max, and you go sort of quite deep into them. And people often say, well, should I join the rowing team? Because I'm going to get a scholarship. I'm like, well, unless you're going to become an Olympic level rower in the next 18 months, probably not gonna help, and also it's fake, right? And people like you who are reading 60,000 applications.
Well, I'm not reading 60,000 applications, but yes, a lot of applications.
A lot of applications. You can spot what's fake and not. So be authentic and try to think a bit outside the box.
The other thing too, when I see people who are trying to do everything, I look at that and I'm like, that's someone who's either going to burn out, because you can't do everything forever, trust me, or there's someone who doesn't really know what they love or care about. And it's fine to taste things and to experiment with things and all of that, but it's also important to understand, like, you develop things that you like and things that, like, you're not going to submit your time to, and that's okay, right? There are very, very, very few people in the world who are great at everything because they do everything well. Very, very rare, right? Those people are few and far between, and there's no reason to become that person if you're not that person.
True. Great. Well, Tim, thank you. Thank you so much for this. This was
great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Enjoy the rest of your time in London.
I will. Thank you.